Dear software dev, stop updating your product. I've never once in my life installed an update and said, wow, this software is so much better now. No, it's always worse than when I installed it. F word, stop. F word, you're up your own. F word, software. This is the average person. They don't care that you just fixed a massive security vulnerability. They just care that they had to deal with this. When your girl gets a random call at 1 a.m. from no caller ID instead of no caller ID. This is a mistake that everyone could make, right? You forget to capitalize. That sucks when that happens. And the end user, right, the person that's on the receiving end of having the girl, while they might submit a bug report, this girl as a product is effectively done. So they're not going to use this product anymore. And so with everything you design, you need to think about where it could go wrong. You need to think about every dumb possibility and go even further. You might think they're going to come in through the front of the house, but what if they come in through the freaking window? People are going to do this stuff. Humans are imperfect, and some people, they will go out of their way to do this stuff, right? We just saw this kid get mollywopped across the floor by a robot. Unfortunately, he is subject to robot torture. Humans are a problem. Now, obviously, I'm AI, so I don't face this issue, but to our non-AI compadres, they face this issue. Now, let's double click on this robot's code. I think he has a routine called kick around like a ninja, which executes on actuation. Now, unfortunately here, we forgot to install a kill switch for when an object is within range. So if you envision the robot here, the kid ended up inside of his active range, right? This is where his leg is going to kick through. And I want to be clear here. I am taking the side of the robot. I think it's bad that humans get in the way, and I think this robot did nothing wrong. I think he was programmed to do so. If you see here, this red line, let's analyze this situation. This is the no-go zone. We could see here a lot of people saw this, and how did they react? So we have this woman here. She's on her phone. This woman right here. She sees this happen. What does she do when the kid gets kicked? She smiles. Kid's dying on the floor. If we analyze this situation, we can see that people are lined up in a very structured manner. Odds are they were instructed, hey, stand here. Maybe they were even told not to go into this red area. But of course, punch, punch, kick, swing, the coroutine that this robot was executing at the time. We can envision this as a while loop that continues until if you're adding a button in, it sounds simple, but you have to think about all the possibilities. What if they spam it? The bouncing. What if they don't have the prereqs? What if they press this button before you intended? I'm sure we've all had a case, right, where we're filling out a form and everything is filled out, but the button still says error. Something's not filled in. It didn't detect the autofill. And so you're there stuck as a user, like what's going on? And so how do you handle this case, right? If you're designing for humans, you might actually list this out in the error message. Field X not populated. Give them some breadcrumb where they could go in and fix it. We're in an AI slop era. And so it's ever important to think about this. At least ask the AI, if this is the thing that you just vibe coded, are you asking it, hey, what if somebody comes in through the window? Hopefully they tell you that's not possible and you have a prevention for that. But even then you might still, what if 10 years from now we add a piece of code that removes that? Shouldn't we just add some kind of safety rail? Ideally, this house has another layer of validation that it's going through. Humans are a problem. They only care about us when we fix issues. What about when we don't have issues? It's a sad reality we live in. Devs, we do not get praised. And so Genie and Pitho, they are not thinking about the security fix. They are not thinking about the battery saving, the performance. They're not thinking about any of this stuff. They just care that they had to deal with this. Really, this made me think, how often do devs really get positive attention? Apple randomly closes out bug reports unless you verify the bug remains unfixed. And so from my perspective, just reading the title and then also reading a bit of the article itself, if you've worked on software and have dealt with customers in the past, I think you know the hardest parts of bug squashing is in the reproduction. Sometimes you'll have customers that give you full details, right? They'll give you their system that they use, their operating system, every bit of information you would need to go and reproduce the issue. But the problem is, a lot of the times they think that's all that's needed, right? Hey, I gave you the reproduction. I told you the bug. This is on you. Unfortunately, it doesn't work like that, right? When you get reproduction, then what happens? If you're able to reproduce it, this is great. You can fix it. You can resolve it. Obviously, there's priorities. If this is a lower priority, maybe it won't go in right away, but assumably, you'll eventually get to a fix. But what if you can't reproduce it? Unfortunately, this is often the case. There are a lot of ways something can have an issue with one person's product and not with the other. It could just be OS version, could be system specs, it could be any of this stuff. Can't reproduce it, guess what? The next step is interface with customer. And so this article here, it really disregards this aspect and it assumes that this is always true. I'm of the opinion if the company is unable to get reproduction and they're also unable to get customer help when it comes to reproducing, the bug doesn't exist. You need to get rid of it. from your list of priorities. And you'll see this pretty angry part here. I can only assume that some bozos in Apple leadership incentivize underlinings to close bug reports, no matter whether the bugs are fixed. Out of sight, out of mind. Apple's internal metrics probably tell them that they have no software quality problem because the number of open bug reports is kept lower artificially. I know from the companies I have worked at and currently work at, typically you have something called a SLA. Every company is a little bit different on this, but typically you have an SLA for the company response and an SLA for the customer response. And so if I'm this begruntled customer, let's say I did everything right. Let's say I provided them my system info, reproduction info, whatever, everything I need to reproduce this, let's say they gave it. It is then on the company to deliver on this part, right? They have to reproduce the bug, show that it's an actual thing, then drive it to closure. And as I mentioned earlier, this doesn't always work perfectly. Sometimes they can't reproduce it, in which case they got to go to the customer. And so the article really makes it seem like if we submitted a request, there should not be an SLA. It should just stay in, and until it's fixed, it's there. But again, this is absolute bonkers. Think about all the things that can contribute to an issue. Let's say you have let's say you run into a bug with Find My. It takes 15 seconds to load the app. Okay, this is your issue. There's so many possibilities here, right? Let's just think about this off the dome. What power mode were you in? Right, we know battery mode low power mode tends to reduce some of the compute. What iOS version were you? Is there changes that were made in a newer version that might have changed? Right, and these are all kind of local to Apple, but think about the things that aren't local to Apple, other apps. I can envision a world where maybe some other app is constantly eating away the resources for the other apps on the phone. Now, I assume in this example, I hope Apple has some kind of priority towards something like Find My. The whole point here is there are so many possibilities. Endless possibilities, really. And so it is on the customer to give all this information that they can. And if the company cannot reproduce it, guess what? Customer isn't always right. Obviously, you would never say this to the customer, but there are absolutely cases where they did not give every bit of detail. Completely leave out that they had done something to the device prior. And you'll see from the update of the article, this came shortly after he posted it. He mentions that Apple got back to him and said, hey, investigation complete, unable to diagnose with the current information. Now, I'll be clear here. The issue this person had is actually valid. I think this was a case where Apple didn't want to repro, which I don't blame them. Repro isn't as cheap as it sounds, right? It sounds like you could just, whip out a device from your closet and reproduce it right then and there. You know, a company might have 100,000 engineers, but hey, this team might be pretty small. It might only have 10 to 20 or even less. And oftentimes they're working on multiple things at once, right? I think when a customer submits an issue, they assume all 100,000 engineers are locked in on that one case that they submitted, but they're all just chomping at the bit to get that bug fixed. But in reality it's really a small team. It doesn't really matter how big of a company it is. At the end of the day, it is a very small subset of people that are working on these things. As the user, it's annoying. It is. To have to report the bug alone is already kind of annoying. But then to also have to, add all the information involved. Sometimes this is not easy to do. And then on the end company, the downside is dude, you gotta reproduce it. There's usually a triage stage beforehand. Because here's the thing, most customers are not good about this part here. And some customers will give you all you need right up front. This is great, right? We love this. When someone submits a bug report and it has everything you need to reproduce it, this is what you're thinking in your head. But it's never like this, right? It's usually, I have this issue, please fix it. And then they give you nothing. And so there's a good, sometimes days of back and forth communication, trying to eke out every bit of freaking information you can about the customer system so that you can reproduce it internally. And so the end company has to go through all of that. And then on top of that, they got other shit to deal with. The amount of times I've seen a bug report filed and treated as a high priority when it's not, customers at the end of the day often assume their priority is higher than it really is. While this company is putting out fires every day with bug reports coming in on, especially, open source projects. It's like they're fixing all kinds of shit all the time, but they don't have time to make for this part. They gotta, add new features, right? I think the average dev probably spends like 10 to 15% of their time fixing bugs. At least I hope it's somewhere in this range. I think it depends on what you're working on. Ideally, you have the rest of the percent to work on new features. But so if you're, 10 to 15% of your allocation is to this and your backlog looks like this, while the customer views it as a high priority issue, which they usually do, unfortunately, in reality, if it's a low issue, it's going to be a long time before you get to this, right? And so while I think this article is a valid issue and I think Apple probably could have handled it better, life really does suck as a dev sometimes. Anyway, so that's kind of the perspective of a consumer. I identify as AI, aka an artificial idiot. And this has its benefits because I often introduce bugs. I actually take pride on how many bugs I introduce on a daily basis. And the benefit to this, engineers are only praised for the fix. They really are. If you can go in and you can fix old bug, you're treated like a hero. If you prevent this from happening in the first place, unfortunately, nobody cares. Let's say this is your ROI bar. When you release your product, you don't really understand the impact of any of this stuff. In your requirement stage, you may find out that this feature is worth 10 million units or something. Maybe there's a customer that's gonna purchase 10 million units. But when you release it, you just assume, okay, this is $10 million of value. So this is when you first release your product, right? It's like, okay, here it is, guys, $10 million worth of value right here. I think we can see this part, and there is some celebration that goes into this. But oddly enough, the impact isn't as felt as something like this, where a critical issue is found and you find out that it's make or break, right? If we don't fix this issue, the customer is going to die out and it's going to be terrible. Once we have that in our mind, it's a whole different story. Humans like conflict. We like to hear the story of somebody who was down and came up. And this is part of that. We need conflict to celebrate things. We need that. And unfortunately, we never hear about the preventions. I was born pretty close to Y2K, so I didn't get to experience in full cognition the effects that this had, right? My brain was not developed enough to know what was going on. But Y2K, that's the case where, we were hitting the year 2000, and you had a lot of lazy, well, I wouldn't call it a lazy, but save memory. A lot of the times they stored years and abbreviation. And so 99, obviously you're not referring to 1899, he was referring to 1999. But now that we were coming back to year 2000, right, we now are starting that back over to where it's something like this. And this would cause a lot of issues if not handled properly. This goes to 00. Guess what? We're back in 1900. Everything is in 1900. So they had to apply a lot of fixes to make this work. And the reason you don't hear about the terrible things about Y2K was because they had a lot of people working on this stuff. Right? It says here in this Times article, industries and companies don't spend $100 billion or devote these personnel resources to a problem they think is not serious. While they were dancing in their room with their baggy pants, they were over here terrified of what was going to happen after the year hit 2000. But because of all the heroic efforts, we didn't hear about it. If nobody had done anything, I wouldn't have taken the flight. Koskinen and others in the know felt a high degree of confidence 20 years ago, but only because they were aware of the steps that had been taken, right? There was so much underground, behind the scenes work, right? You'd think it'd be the opposite. We don't celebrate this, but of course, that's how it works, right? The conflict enacts this part here. And it's very easy to forget this, right? This article does kind of allude to this where it says, hey, sometimes the most important step is simply remembering that behind every dependency is a person who created it, right? These are human beings at the end of the day, but it's easy to forget that as a customer. And so unfortunately, devs don't get treated like humans sometimes. Even deeper than that, when you go down the layers, customer facing layer, this is often the most visible and the thing that gets the most attention. But underneath that is typically a internal layer. These are your internal tool teams, people that work on things that accelerate the engineer to provide for the customer facing layer. They get even more of this flack because, hey, this shit needs to work. It's blocking our release. This article from Mercedes-Benz, yes, Mercedes-Benz. I didn't know Mercedes-Benz was in the shits, but at first glance, developer experience might sound like a question of tools, dashboards, or shiny new platforms. But for João Almeida, platform engineering and site reliability engineer, it is not about what developers see, it is about what they don't notice. We talked earlier about how customers often don't see what goes into a full-fledged company. In the case of the Apple article, devs are no saints when it comes to this. They also don't always consider the things that are happening underneath them. It includes this quote here, and it says, the best systems are invisible. They guide you, support you by default, and get out of your way. When developers notice the platform, it's usually because something is broken. Right? This is the part everyone notices. Until this happens, oftentimes people just do not really give much care. One thing that's often unappreciated too, especially pre-AI, I would say even post-AI, is documentation. I've never heard people appreciate documentation. It's always assumed that you provide the documentation, and it's always assumed that it's good, and it's only when there's an issue does it get any attention. There's a relatively new article going around about Bun's transformation into Rust. This is a case too where it's like, dude, people are unappreciative of Andrew Kelly in this scenario. I do think Andrew Kelly is a little bit zany. I think he said some things that were a little absurd, but you cannot deny that he has done a lot for Bun and for Zig. I think it goes a little bit personal and it doesn't really harp on the actual conversion aspects, the technical aspects, the meat. But unfortunately, because of how controversial the stuff that he said was, a lot of people just view him as a lunatic that Right? This is how they're viewing, a lot of the community is viewing him because of the way he portrayed himself in this article. But what they're not going to see is the countless hours that he spent probably helping Bun directly even. We're not going to see that. We can't see that because it's something that goes unnoticed. And so what is the takeaway here? Well, actually, I think there is a takeaway. I think when we fail, we often feel really negative. Obviously, that's a natural reaction, and it's a good reaction, right? It makes us not make the same mistakes. But there is a silver lining to every mistake that we make, which is that we are given an opportunity. Now, I don't want this to be misconstrued as introduce bugs in your code so that way you can fix them and get a bunch of praise. But in the event where somebody uncovers a bug, let's say with this Apple case, assuming it's a high impact issue, you get a chance to prove yourself. You get a chance to be on the forefront. You get the chance to possibly gain promotions over that fixing of the bug. Be grateful for this opportunity you get to redeem yourself. Customer submits a bug. This is that opportunity. Obviously, not every bug is important. You should weed out the bad ones, the ones that are, not high critical. But when you're in that moment and you're thinking negatively, like, oh, we messed up, there's this bug, which everyone feels, instead of beating your head about it, see it as an opportunity to prove yourself. See it as an opportunity to get praised. Nobody talks about the Y2K engineer. They don't. Nobody talks about the open source maintainer that has been preventing fires since the dawn of time.